for super loud. So, but we also are getting very ready for. No, we're good. We're getting very ready for Passover right now. We're inundated with last minute requests for people to join us. We're trying to accommodate everybody and make sure everybody has a place for Seder. Once again, the last couple of years, all we had to do is make sure people had food. Now we have to actually make sure there's a place for them to come together for Passover, which is wonderful. It's a wonderful thing to do, but it's almost like, again, relearning a little bit what we're supposed to do for Passover, which the last few years has kind of been a little bit more home-based, a little bit more focused on what we do rather than what everyone's doing. But we did last year, as a lot of you know, we made sure that every senior who wanted a Passover meal through the senior center would be able to get one. And we're doing that again this year. So we made sure that every senior in Santa Clarita had a meal. And tomorrow we're preparing them. And we've got 100 meals going out to the seniors through the senior center. So I want to thank Sheila Petrie for that. And actually, again, last year, Sharon was there. Sharon Kale was no longer at the senior center because she's in Washington State, but she helped make sure that we could get this done. And so we're hoping that this will be an ongoing project for Temple Beth Ami, that we'll be able to do this every year for Passover. And yeah, it started during the pandemic and hopefully will carry through as one of the traditions that becomes part of our Passover traditions here. So that was a really cool thing. And it's maybe one of those things, those blessings that came out of the pandemic. For some of you that hopefully saw the piece that I wrote that the Signal ran, when we look back at this year's Passover, when we think about the first Passover coming out of a time when a lot of us didn't have a lot of good times, that maybe we look at this time as a hopeful time for taking on new challenges, for breaking out of the familiar, breaking out of the ways we did things, and take advantage of this great reset. I talked about it a couple of weeks ago. The message resonated with some people. I got nice feedback from people like Philip and other people. And so I developed the idea a little bit and then shared it out with the Signal and for everybody to think about, because it's not just a Jewish message. Obviously, it's a message for everybody, because the holidays of Easter are also about potential and new beginnings. And so, I felt it was a message that Christians and people of all faiths can learn from, and hopefully use this time to grow. So hopefully we can push ourselves a little bit. So I have the wrong page up right now for some reason. I'm going to, right now I have Exodus chapter 39. I'm supposed to be in Genesis 39. I was looking at this. Why is it talking about vestments? It's talking about the priestly outfits. Very different story from what we have today, which is a continuation of Jacob's children. The story today focuses on Joseph, and Genesis chapter 39, which we'll read today, and maybe we'll get into a little bit of 40. But sorry, Mary, do you want to grab that one? Sorry, I forgot. I'm also recording. There's something up on our screen in here, so I want to take that off. So thank you, Mary. And the last few chapters, and it's hard to believe, again, over these last few weeks, we read chapter 37, which is the story of Joseph being sold into slavery, being thrown into a pit and thrown into slavery. And then we read the story. Hold on one second.
It's okay now.
We're good? Okay. So, believe it or not, this chapter 39 is part of the chapters, goes back to chapter 37. It's all part of the same Torah portion. Chapter 37 was Joseph being thrown into the pit, sold by his brothers into slavery. Chapter 38 was a story we read about Tamar and Judah basically being tricked into sleeping with his daughter-in-law and giving her a child. And now we're in chapter 39. So these three stories are all part of the same Torah portion. And it's hard to believe that, again, if we had to read this in one parsha, we would have been speeding through this and not giving any of these narratives their just due and their attention. That's really required to look at these stories. The last word that we read about Joseph at the end of chapter 37 was that he got sold. The Midianites, meanwhile, sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar. And that was the last words that we read, that he was sold into slavery. And then chapter 38 is back with Judah. And then 39 is now the story of now we go back to Joseph. What's interesting is chapter 38 is a story of Judah basically having to do the right thing, but it's a story of us, in a sense, it's a sexual story, because it's a story of Judah being tricked into sleeping with his own daughter-in-law in order to do the right thing, which is impregnate her or make sure she can have a kid. This is not the first story of weird and kind of things going awry when it comes to sex, because we also had the story in Genesis chapter 34 of Dinah and how she was raped and essentially taken by Shechem, and then her brothers rescued her and killed all the Shechemites. That was chapter 34. So we had 34 and then 38. In the middle of that, we had the story of Joseph being thrown into a pit. And now we get to chapter 39. And what's interesting about that is when we take those last stories together, what we're left with here in chapter 39 is almost like a cumulative effect of all of those themes being played out in this story. So, as you'll see, there is violence, there is sex, there is hostage taking, there is things going awry, trying to fix things. Let's take a look at this story that you may have heard before, but you maybe didn't spend enough time really looking at, which we're going to do tonight. So chapter 39 begins. When Joseph was taken down to Egypt, Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh, and his prefect, a type of Egyptian official, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. So here it says that the Ishmaelites did it. We talked about it before. There's a difference of opinion whether it was Ishmaelites or Midianites that sold him. But regardless, he winds up with Potiphar, who it says is a prefect or an official. And it actually has two words, which is why it puts in brackets a type of official. It's clearly an important official. And we'll turn to Mary. What does the King James say for this? Captain of the guard. What's the first word it uses for prefect? Does it say prefect? Officer. So there are two titles here. Saris Pharaoh and Sar HaTabachim. And so we're not really sure what those titles mean, but they're definitely important. And so Pharaoh we're already introduced to here. It doesn't say which Pharaoh, but it never tells us in the Bible which Pharaoh we're talking about until much, much later. We get Pharaoh's name. But really throughout all of the Torah, we never get a Pharaoh's name. We assume it's Ramses or his father or something like that in certain places, like in the story of Moses. But here we really don't know. In Exodus, we really don't know. And we hear this guy's name, though, in particular, Potiphar. So we do know the man's name, Potiphar. And we know he works for Pharaoh. We know he's in the inner circle of Pharaoh. That's all we really know about him. And I guess you could say by this translation, we're not even sure what type of official it is. I was going to tell you something, but I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait to give you one of the possibilities of what he is. Yeah, I'm going to wait. So it says Adonai was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he stayed in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that Adonai was with him, and that Adonai lent success to everything he undertook, he took a liking to Joseph. He made him his personal attendant and put him in charge of his household, placing in his hands all that he owned. So you can see what happens is that Joseph does something or some things that prove his competence, that prove that he's someone worthy of responsibility, that he's lucky or that he's successful in the things that he does. And, the word successful here means that when he tried to do something, it worked out, right? The word matzliach is used twice. They translate it as successful. What's the King James translation for matzliach? To prosper. That all he did to prosper. But there is a sense in here that there's a monetary gain that happens when he touches things, right? And so he's just one of those guys that can make things happen, make money happen. And that's when we say today in Hebrew, modern Hebrew, we say b'hatzlacha, which we usually mean with good luck, but it doesn't really mean good luck, with success. Be successful. Hatzlacha means with success. It's not really like mazel tov, which means good luck, good stars, good fortune. May your destiny be good, essentially. But the hatzlacha is like what you say when you undertake a new venture, when you do something in business, or when you start off on a new journey. You say b'hatzlacha, or when you go to college. It's not mazel tov, which is more congratulations and more good luck. That's wonderful that more good things like that. But b'hatzlacha really means with good fortune, with good success. And almost always there's a connotation of monetary success. So he seems to be creating monetary success for his owner. And so he gives him more responsibility. That's an important theme with Joseph, is that he's always, wherever he is, he's given more responsibility. So whatever he does, he undertakes, he ends up becoming successful. And there are people like that. There are people who bring good success to the people they work for. They get promoted, and then they bring more, they bring success to that person. Oftentimes it's because they work hard, but that's a good way to do it. But he does seem to have the sense that God is with him. And even this Egyptian sees that. He sees that God is with him. How did he see it? Well, maybe again, it's not normal what's happening with Joseph. There seems to be some divine intervention for him. Any comments, any questions? Here we get to the good part. And from the time the Egyptian put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, Adonai blessed his house for Joseph's sake, so that the blessing of Adonai was upon everything that he owned, in the house and outside, meaning in the fields, with the animals, with the livestock, with the fields, the crops. He left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and with him there, he paid attention to nothing save the food that he ate. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome. Now, it tells us basically again that Potiphar doesn't have anything to worry about with Joseph in charge. He literally can do not, he doesn't have to do anything. He just has to sit there and eat. That's it. Everything's good. But the last few words here are a whole idea that we didn't hear until now, which is that Joseph was well built and handsome. Now, obviously, that information is going to be very important for the next line. But it seems as though Joseph is bringing such success to Potiphar that, again, he entrusts him with everything. He doesn't have to think about anything. And what sets up this following story is that Joseph is given free reign in the house. Remember, he came in as a slave, and now he's basically running everything. And that's what happens. He's given free reign in the house. So this isn't normal. This isn't a normal situation. So again, the words that are used here for Joseph was well built and handsome is a horrible translation. What does the King James translation, which I'm sure is far more accurate, say?
Joseph was a goodly person and wealthy.
Not wild about that one either, but at least it doesn't say anything about how well built he was. I will tell you, that's a huge stretch to say he was well built. And actually, I think to some extent actually goes against what Joseph actually looked like. Because there's a sense here, the descriptions that are used here, if they sound familiar, let's just look back real quick at where else we've seen this. I think some of you could probably figure out where we've heard these words before used. Anyone want to guess? Anybody want to guess? Here. Here we go. Everybody see where I'm pointing right now?
Yeah, but they're also translating it as shapely, well built, right?
Well, shapely does imply something about her body type.
But yeah, I mean, I see it. Yafet is just Yafet is like pretty.
It's not just that. It says Yafet Toar, the Yafet Mareh. It actually says the same words.
Yeah. What does Tawar mean?
It has also a sense of Yafa is good, pretty. Toar is like a pretty. It has the same connotation that it's like it's pretty appearance.
It looks like
When you say, you'd very rarely say a man is yafa. It's like good looking. That's what I would call it. I would say good looking. Well, the second one, yafat mar'eh, is good looking. Yafat toar means good. maybe you could say good proportions, a good shape, a good build, good whatever, but it also is just all, everything about.
So you feel like it's saying that he's effeminate?
Oh, I 100% think it's saying he's effeminate, which is why I think calling him well-built is insane, because that seems to imply that he's like strongly built. When we say a man is well-built, we don't mean that we usually, I don't know anybody who would have a connotation to that he's, got nice proportions. That things were in the right place, if you will. You don't really say that about a guy. When you say the guy's well built, it means he's built strong, which is why the translation was that. I will tell you that 100% the rabbis saw the fact that his mother, Rachel, right? His mother and him are both pretty and well proportioned, look good. They look good. And the same words are used for both. It's not a normal description of a guy. It's the same words. Yafeh is the male form, but Toar and Yafeh Mar'eh. It's the same words. So it makes sense. Joseph's mother was beautiful, and he's beautiful too. But he seems to be beautiful in a fairly effeminate way. He seems to be beautiful. Look, most people would say, and again, I'm not making a generalization, but most people would say that there are two ways that guys are good looking. They're either good looking and they're in a very masculine way, or they're very good looking in a fairly effeminate way. It's true. I'm not making it up and I'm not judging it. I'm just saying that most people would say there's two kinds of ways that guys would look good looking. One would be, again, in the fact that they are almost look like a woman. Joseph seems to fall into that category. Now, it doesn't matter from the standpoint of what happens now, in that he's he would be attractive to other men for that reason, but that doesn't matter because he's attractive to a woman. And as we're going to see in particular, who he's attractive. After a time, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." What's the translation there, Mary?
Exactly that.
Okay. Yeah. And the word lie, shichvav imi, is to lie down with me. So she gets right to it. She's not saying, "Hey, let's spend, why don't you help me move these things around in the bedroom?" She literally says, "Lay down. Yeah, let's lie down together." That's what she says. So she's very direct. So, the translation after a time. What is your translation, Mary, in the King James?
And it came to pass after these days.
Yeah. After a time seems to mean like, took a long time. The Hebrew seems to imply when Joseph had this role to play in the house amongst Potiphar's things, but maybe that's because now she has access to him. Look, if he's a slave and she doesn't have access to him because he's not working out in the fields, he's staying out with the other slaves, he's not living in the house, by a certain point, it says that everything inside and outside the house was Joseph's. So Joseph is now maybe around the house more, but it doesn't matter. At some point, and that's kind of the way I would translate it, at some point, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." So she is definitely attracted to him, and she definitely is putting him in a fairly awkward position. I saw Harvey yawn just now. I guess this happens to Harvey all the time. So anyways, all I'm saying is that this is a very uncomfortable position. We now know a lot about power dynamic of what happens when people are working for other people. And it does happen, it does happen to men, and obviously over the history of the world, this happened far more to women, but it does happen to men. It did happen to men. It still happens to men. In this case, the story of Joseph is a story of sexual harassment, sexual dynamic where an employee is put into a horrible situation. And here Joseph is, there's a direct approach. There's no beating around the bush. This is right to the point. Lie down with me. Anybody have anything to say so far? Don't jump the gun yet. Anybody, don't get to the parts we haven't read yet, but anybody have anything about this story thus far? Okay. All right. So now let's read how does Joseph get himself out of this situation? He refused. He said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master gives no thought to anything in this house. All that he owns, he has placed in my hands. He wields no more authority in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except yourself, since you are his wife. How then could I do this most wicked thing and sin before God?" And so Joseph clearly understands the responsibility that has been given him. His attempt to get out of this is to say to the woman, "Look, your husband's given me all this authority. How can I violate his trust? How can I do this to him? How can I?" And then he says, "How can I do a horrible thing? How can I do this wicked thing? And how can I sin before God? How can I do this horrible thing from an ethical and from a religious standpoint? How can I do this?" Now, I will tell you, the rabbis give us interesting midrash, a lot of midrash on this. And by the way, this story has captivated people for thousands of years, not just Jews. In the Quran, there's an extensive surah, there's an extensive chapter in the Quran about Joseph and Zuleika, Yusuf and Zuleika. She's not mentioned by name in the Torah. We know she's just Potiphar's wife. But in the Midrash, and then later on in Islamic literature, she is given a name. And she's known in Islam as Zuleika. The story, the romance between these two is very real. The Midrash even starts to give us this idea that Joseph wasn't tempted. He was tempted by this.
Why does the Quran elaborate on it?
What?
Why does the Quran elaborate on it? Does it care so much about it?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. One, the story takes place in Egypt, so it takes place outside of Israel, which I think to some extent is already, it's not that Islam already by that point necessarily was rooted in Egypt, because it wasn't. It was still much more of an Arabian Peninsula issue. But I think there's a dynamic here about a ruler and a slave, which is it is important in Islam, because Islam definitely allows for slavery. So there's an interesting dynamic about slaves. It's romantic from the standpoint of it's a forbidden romance, and so I think there's an interest there. And it was an interesting, I want to say, it was an interesting story for the rabbis as well. The Midrash is extensive on this. So I don't know that Islam built upon it, because they also, and they did. Islam also was very familiar by that time with the Talmud and the Midrash. Those legends had already been built up over time. But I think there's an interesting dynamic here of this power dynamic, which I think was interesting to Muslims. It was interesting. There's obviously, it pops up in Christian literature and Christian art, Christian midrash, if you will, but I don't think there's anything as extensive as the Joseph midrash in the Quran as it is in Christian sources. But it really is an interesting story for us because it poses these questions for us about Joseph's role in the house and the fact that if you think about it, Potiphar's role in this, in trusting Joseph with everything, means that not only is Joseph in a situation where he could have gotten away with it perhaps, but there's a real sense in here of Joseph understanding his place, respecting his place, and maybe that's why it was maybe a bigger issue in Islam. But in Judaism, it's the fact that when he's put into this situation, he also then says, it's a sin before God. And if I do this, I'm committing a religious offense too. It's not just wrong. It's not just unethical. It's not just immoral. It's that I'm actually sinning before God. And I think that's the point that the rabbis actually pick up on. But they did also pick up on the fact that there was an attraction between the two of them. So now I'm going to lay down the thing that I told you I was going to share with you, which is what we read at the very beginning about Potiphar. Who Potiphar is? Who is this Potiphar? He is the Saris Pharaoh. It is possible that coming with the position of Saris Pharaoh, that he himself, in order to be the Saris, had part of his body removed.
He's a eunuch.
Yes.
So what was he in charge of the wives of the Pharaoh?
What was that?
Was he in charge of the wives of the Pharaoh?
That's one possibility. That's one possibility. But this idea that he was a eunuch is one that the rabbis picked up on, because in other places, the title of Saris is used for the eunuch. So it's an interesting idea because the Egyptians did have eunuchs in the royal court. And is it possible that Potiphar was one of them? Which then leads to an interesting question, which is, to some extent, is this a woman who cannot have sexual relations with her own husband? Which further complicates the situation. So I will tell you that is embedded in the text as a possibility. Now, it doesn't say that, but one of the traditional understandings is that is what is also at play in this, which is that this is part of what is also happening. Keep this in mind as we read this story and what happens. There's only a few more lines. This is actually a very short story in the Torah. It's only 12 verses. Let's read it. And as much as she coaxed Joseph day after day, he did not yield to her request to lie beside her, to be with her. So in case you're thinking, is this just a platonic lying next to her? No, because here it says, lihiot ima, to be with her. And here's what it tells us again, which is this was not a one-time occurrence. The Torah is very clear that this happened yom yom. This happened day after day. This was going on for a long time, and it happened repeatedly. So the midrash on this, before we get to the next line, the midrash on this is very interesting too, because the rabbis basically say this woman was overcome with desire for him. She just couldn't get him out of her head. The more she tried to do it, the worse it got. She tried to get away from him. She tried everything, and she's stuck with him in the house. So she has no choice but to see him every day. And she doesn't know what she's going to do. Now, the Midrash basically says that she gets sick, physically sick, with her desire for Joseph. And there's a wonderful midrash, very well-known midrash actually, because there's different versions of it and there's layers of the story. So it was like there, and then they added it to it, and they changed it, and but this midrash was so extensive. So there's this wonderful midrash that she's just going out of her mind for Joseph. And her friends, her Egyptian buddies down at the club, at the tennis club, see Potiphar's wife, and they say, "What's wrong with you? You know, you've been pining after this guy, the pool boy, right? All the time. You can't get this guy out of your head. What's wrong with you? He's just a slave." They say, "What's wrong with you? You should know better." Potiphar's wife, "I just can't. You don't understand. This guy is crazy good looking." So she says to her friends, "Come over to my house and you'll see." So she brings them over to the house. She has a banquet for them. She puts out the fruit on the table, a banquet. And they're peeling the fruit. And Joseph walks by and he's helping them with the dinner, with the lunch, the cocktails and the fruit. And these women are so entranced, they're so fixated on Joseph that they start cutting their fingers. They can't look at the fruit, and they start bleeding as they're cutting their fingers because they're looking at Joseph. They just can't take their eyes off. So this is what happens when they see him. And then she basically says, "I told you, and I got to see this kid every day." So she proved to them that this was real hard for her. The midrash of the women peeling fruit and peeling their own fingers as they're trying to take their eyes off. And here's the story. One such day, he came into the house to do his work, none of the household being there inside. She caught hold of him by his garment and said, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and got away and fled outside. When she saw that he had left it in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to her servants and said to them, "Look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. This one came to lie with me, but I screamed aloud." Wow. So
Sexual harassment.
this is sexual harassment. And now she turned the tables on him, right?
Right.
She basically said he tried to attack me. Now, of course, you know, thousands of years of history by then and thousands of years of history since then would lead us to say, come on, that guy attacked her. But we know, because we read the story. We've been with the narrator the whole time. So we know what's been going on. But once again, Joseph is being undone by the garments. See how the garments play a big role in this story. Joseph's coat. Jacob's taken Esau's garments. The garments are part of the story. So now he's left his garment behind. He's left his clothes with her. Evidence that he's been there. When he heard me screaming, I'm sorry. What?
Dally, Yitzhak, same
Yep.
root.
Yep.
So that kind of supports the that thing that Ishmael was didn't they use the same verb for Ishmael with Isaac?
You mean playing with?
Yeah, Dally. But here it definitely has a sexual context, you know, or
Yeah, it cannot be anything other than sexual. That's a heck right here. That's what Sarah's talking about. To play with.
because I've always heard that like Ishmael and Isaac, there was something there that, you know, when Sarah says, get rid of him because he was playing with my son, right? But here, when you see the same word used in this way, it's like, okay, now I can see that it's used in a way where it definitely means sex.
Yeah. Which is why they use the word dally, which, has a more sexual connotation of playing with someone sexually. What's the King James say? Mock? Oh, wow. Mock us. The King James went with mocking, which has a connotation of he's playing with us, right? He's which doesn't capture the sexual innuendo or sexual impact of this at all, which is she's claiming he tried to attack her. It's not really a mock. That's a rape. She's basically saying he came and attacked me. Right. And so I got him off of me by screaming. He left his garment with me and he fled outside. And she kept his garment beside her until his master came home. Now, here's the big confrontation. Then she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew slave whom you brought into this house, into our house, came to, let's be, right? Dally with me. Is it still mock there? Oh my goodness. That is crazy. It is definitely not mocking. Letzachek, there could be other translations for that, but clearly here it's playing with, but in a sexual way. And it seems like a pretty serious way. So potentially serious way. Nothing funny about this. But when I screamed at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and fled outside. When his master heard the story that his wife told him, namely, thus and so your slave did to me, he was furious. Vayichar apo is the words that are used, which King James will tell us, Mary, it means
His wrath was kindled.
His wrath was kindled. Wrath was kindled. He was angry. Very important, folks. It doesn't say who he was angry with. It just says he was angry. Now, the rabbis comment on this, and I don't think you have to have read this story more than once to understand that Potiphar is in a very weird situation here, which is, who does he believe? Does he believe his wife? Does he believe that his wife is capable of making up a story like this? Has he seen anything in Joseph's behavior that would lead him to believe that Joseph would do this? Does he know something about his wife where he would kind of believe that maybe she's done something like this before? But it doesn't say he was furious with Joseph. Just keep that in mind. It just says he was furious, or that he was especially angry. So Joseph's master put him in prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. And it says, but even while he was there in prison, Adonai was with Joseph, extending kindness to him and disposing the chief jailer favorably towards him. Well, those are two verses that kind of obviously read them together because they even have a comma there. They don't even have a period and then a new line here. But it says that Joseph's master put him in prison, where the king's prisoners are kept. Which I assume is, they're using the Pharaoh and the king interchangeably. He has access to the royal prison.
In other words, he got camp fed.
Yeah. Well, in those days, Philip Wasserman, who is an attorney, can tell you that prison is a relatively recent invention for the common people. The idea of having a prisoner in jail for average ordinary citizens only goes back a couple hundred years. In the olden times, they didn't put the average ordinary person in jail. They either put them with whipping or humiliation or fines, or they killed them. But the idea of keeping people in prison for 30, 40 years for crimes didn't exist. The idea of punishing people or rehabilitating people in prison did not exist until like literally about 250, 300 years ago. Didn't exist.
Correct. And at one time in England, where we get most of our common law, but at one time in England, all crimes were considered capital crimes. It didn't matter. So if you shoplifted or pickpocketed or whatever, you were hanged. There was no distinction between a misdemeanor and a felony, and all felonies were capital.
So
Everything
Joseph, with Joseph here being punished, and again, really the only place he can be put in jail is a royal jail because there are no other jails. What we're left with here, folks, is the fact that it seems actually, on the face of it, that Potiphar did not believe that Joseph attacked his wife.
Say this because you didn't kill him.
Because 100% that would have been what would have happened
Right.
to a slave who attacked his master's wife.
he would the slave would have been executed. It would have been the death penalty
Immediately.
immediately.
So the fact that this is what happens is pretty clear evidence that Potiphar is not taking his wife's side on it, but he really has no choice because he can't call his wife a liar because then he looks bad. He looks like, it demeans his own family, his own choices. There's a great version of this in the Joseph that was done, the TNT movie that came out about 20 or so years ago, the Potiphar that was done as part of that Bible series. Potiphar is played by Ben Kingsley, who's a pretty good actor. Joseph is a guy named Paul Mercurio, who wasn't in a lot of stuff, but he's a pretty good actor. He does a very good job as Joseph. Leslie Ann Warren plays Potiphar's wife, and she does a great job as Potiphar's wife. She's the perfect age and the perfect kind of look to be Potiphar's wife. And really, it shows Ben Kingsley in one of his kind of like, really great acting modes, where he basically looks at Joseph and says, I don't really know what to do. I believe you, but I have to do something. I mean, I hate having to do this to you, and I hate having to do this to myself, because everything you do is bringing me good luck. It's bringing me fortune. I'm successful because of you now. So I don't want to do this, but I have no choice. I will not kill you. I will not execute you, because that would not be right. But I have to do something. And so he puts him into the prison, which again is not being in jail. I mean, I want to make this clear. This is not a normal place. The only people, what? Well, it's not only white collar, it's only for people that the Pharaoh puts in. And again, maybe Potiphar, as Pharaoh's assistant, Pharaoh's courtier, has access to it. Maybe some of the courtiers, can have access to the royal jail, the royal prison, but it's not for people to go to normally. So this is an unusual situation where, again, Pharaoh might have put people in there who he got ticked off at, that did something to him or were responsible for some financial mishap or whatever, or somebody he's investigating, or somebody that he's about to kill, but he's got to put him in jail while he figures out, are there any accomplices or whatever else, but it's not a normal thing. This is not a normal kind of situation. Now, what's interesting about it is that here in Genesis, we were confronted with a story about what it's like to be incarcerated. And in this case, of course, it's completely an unjustified situation. It's somebody who is in prison, in jail for something that they didn't do. They're being held. And here's a guy who already had his freedom taken away by being sold into slavery. And now it's gotten worse again, because now he's had that freedom taken away. The freedom that he earned again as Potiphar's essentially making Potiphar making him the head of the house. So now he's come down again. So, you know, we talk about Joseph being on a roller coaster. You know, he goes up and down, up and down. And he's hit another down place right here. He's at maybe now the lowest point in his life. Because really, what hope does he have now? Because he's literally waiting to find out if sometime down the road he's going to be executed. We don't know. We don't know what his future holds for him. Because when he's thrown into prison, it doesn't look good. But of course, we hear right away, the head of the jail, the chief jailer, puts him in charge or extends him. And we're about to hear it. He puts him in charge there too, but he likes him. So the chief jailer likes him too. So here's a guy who started out as a shepherd boy back in Canaan. He winds up working for the Pharaoh's assistant, Potiphar. Gets very high up there. Now he's in jail. Now, a Hebrew kid in jail is probably not going to fare too well. But this isn't your typical kind of jail. So if it is a white collar type place, then maybe it's not as bad as some of the other jails or kind of some of the kind of ideas of what jail would look like today. Some of the jails, again, that we would really see today. Now, as a lot of people know, I spent 6 years visiting Jews in prison all across California. And so I saw lots of stuff in that time, stuff that I'll never forget. But working and visiting with Jews, and of course, through that work with people of all backgrounds who were in prison, yeah, if you're a Jew in prison, things are pretty hairy, can be pretty bad. Again, no matter what, Joseph is probably unique in being a Hebrew in prison because there aren't a lot of Hebrews probably in Egypt by this point. It'd have to be his family. He'd have to know them because at this point, there's really only about 70 Hebrews in the world. Abraham's descendants, or at least Isaac and Jacob's descendants now, they're not many of them. So this would have been unique. Not a lot of people would have seen anybody from his family there. And he's not from Egypt. He's not an Egyptian. What did they make of Joseph here in his prison situation? Thought about that a lot as I would meet Jews in prison. I'd share with them this story. We talk about Joseph. Try to draw some inspiration from this story.
What's the prisoner saying?
Well, interestingly, almost everybody who's in prison and jail, because I went to both. I went to the county jails, but I also then eventually spent a lot of time in CDC in the California prison situation, prisons across California. Interestingly, almost everybody in prison doesn't believe they should be in prison. Almost everybody feels that they're innocent or unjustly convicted or unjustly incarcerated. Almost everybody. I did find occasionally a few people who would say that the verdict or the sentence that they got was just, but very rarely. But those ones who did feel that they had been, were doing the time that they should, were few and far between. The average person definitely felt that they shouldn't be in prison. Look, part of the problem is that, again, Joseph has no business. We know he has no business being in prison. He had no business being in Egypt. But it's very hard when people are in prison today. And remember, I was visiting people back in 2002, I started. Prisons were extremely overcrowded then. Things have gotten a little bit better in some ways. We've just kind of gotten used to it. But it was very hard for people because in our country today, we oftentimes see people that we know are guilty get away with crimes. And so it is hard to talk to someone who's serving a sentence, maybe because they had bad representation. And to know that if they had a better lawyer, they may not have gotten prison time. There was also frustrations in seeing people who, and occasionally, it was very occasionally, but I did see people who got third strikes who probably could have probably lived a different life if they didn't have their third strike. But it's tough. It was tough because justice is not always equitable, obviously, in this country. And, you know, when you see a guy like OJ running around free, it's real hard to look at people and say, yeah, well, too bad you didn't have good lawyers.
Or the people, since they are so overcrowded, they get released.
Yeah, well, whenever there'd be any kind of releases or discussions about release, prison release, occasionally California would say, well, we've got to free up some space. So we're going to let everybody out who's done this much time of this. And people would get so excited. It would be like, did you hear what's happening? And people, these rumors would start going around the prisons that they're going to let everybody out who's done this much time. And all of a sudden, all these guys become amazing math whizzes doing 3/4 time plus, they're like, I have no idea what you're saying, but I'm sure, sure you've done the math. But people would, all the time be looking at, oh, maybe we're going to get released because of overcrowding, or because, their state has to do something in order to balance the budget. Or it's hard, again, it's hard to make sense of these situations, but it was very hard for Jewish inmates in particular, because, and I always think about this, is because in prisons in California essentially are 3 classifications: white, black, and Hispanic. There's actually 2 Hispanics. There's northern and southern Hispanic inmates. There's only 3 categories or 4 categories, and they won't mix inmates with different races. This is not schools and environments where they want to integrate people. They want everybody to behave and not to stab each other. And so in order to reduce the stabbing,
There's a lot of
they separate inmates. And so what did a Jewish inmate do? It meant that the Jewish inmates generally classified themselves as white. Well, kosher meals are another story, but the problem with the white classification is, if you're a white inmate in California prisons, you pretty much have to identify as a white Aryan, which meant that almost every white Jewish inmate, which is most Jewish inmates, were being put in cells with white supremacists. It almost guaranteed it.
That's not.
There's no choice, because they would not put a white inmate, they would not put a white Jewish inmate in a prison cell with a Hispanic or black inmate. This is real, folks. This is not like, I saw this with my own eyes. It's not a question.
There are some exceptions. I had some interaction with a couple of criminal cases. I won't bring it up here, but I'll let you know, back channel, Rabbi, of a case I know where a white inmate, the only way for this young man to survive in prison, sadly, was to get into a cell with a black gang member who could protect him, but there was a price to be paid.
Yeah, well, that's not a normal thing. Most white Jewish inmates.
This is just in California, you're saying?
Yeah.
It was a case that the family asked me to look into and appeal for, but a very sad case. He was this white man was not Jewish.
Well, the Jewish inmates that I dealt with, for the most part, every one of them at one point or another had been at some point shared a cell with the white supremacists. Now, I will tell you.
Do they just try to hide it?
What?
Do they just try to hide their Jewishness? I mean, that would make the most sense, right?
I will tell you this. No, Sarah, I will tell you that for the most part, while white supremacist gang is pretty much mandatory. You cannot keep that. When you're sharing yourself with someone for months and months at a time, you end up getting to know that person really well. And for the most part, Jewish inmates were not attacked by their white Aryan inmate, their cellmate. They did not happen. So it happened sometimes, very rarely, but most of the time it did not happen. Which means that most of the time when people identify as a white Aryan, they have to, but they're not necessarily like wanting, this is not something they necessarily believe, they just have to do it while they're in their prison situation. So we had a lot, I mean, almost every Jew I knew had spent time with somebody who had swastika tattoos in their cell with them. But again, for the most part, they did not get attacked. And it was those kind of situations where you'd say to somebody, look, what are you going to do? Like people would call it, they would tell me, hey, my son is in a cell with a white Aryan. And I'd say, well, that's pretty much going to happen to him for the rest of the time he's in jail, in prison.
What is the reason you think that they didn't get attacked?
Because for the most part, they really don't want to be part of a gang. They have to be a part of a gang. And for the most part, it's not like they have to stab a Jewish person because they first of all, there aren't that many, and they really don't. So it's scary. You see swastikas and Hitler the Heil Hitler tattoo all over the place, the 88 tattoo all over the place. And it's weird, when you see it right in front of you. But I also understood that this was part of our culture. And when we remember that, there's 250,000 or so men incarcerated in California, I mean, that's a whole city. That's a large city of people that are sitting in prison right now. 250,000 able-bodied men that are in prison.
Rabbi, the Los Angeles County jail system, which is not a prison, but the jail system in Los Angeles County is the largest jail system in the world.
Yeah, that's the county.
That's just the county of LA, the largest in the world. Bigger than New York, bigger than anywhere in any other country.
So it's a weird thing to think about, this world, this city within California that is incarcerated people. But it's we would do a Passover Seder every year. Not one, I would go to 3 or 4 prisons to do Passover Seders. And every year doing a Passover Seder with a message of freedom. What's the message to somebody who is not free? We'll talk about that when we finish this up. Let's look what happens with Joseph. So it says the chief jailer put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in that prison. And he was the one to carry out everything that was done there. The chief jailer did not supervise anything that was in Joseph's charge because Adonai was with him. And whatever he did, Adonai made successful. And that's the end of chapter 39, which again, when you see that Joseph is put in charge of the prison, it's exactly the same language that he had with Potiphar, which is that Potiphar puts him in charge of the home and he doesn't have to think about anything. And now Joseph's put in charge of the prison and the chief jailer doesn't have to worry about anything anymore. He basically says, go take care of it. He does. But Joseph is given this tremendous responsibility, this tremendous blessing that he brings to all the work that he does. And once again, he's successful. Now, where Joseph is right now in the story, when we stop the story right now, Joseph's life is about as good as it can be for somebody who's in prison. And this is actually one of the things that I would talk to people who are in prison, which is what happens to Joseph, who is there. Let's assume you're here and you don't belong here. It's not the issue. Is it possible within the confines of where you are right now, the restrictions and the lack of freedom that you have right now, is it possible for you to make this situation as good as it can be for where it is right now? Is it possible for you to do the work and for you to make this existence as good as it can be, even if you don't want to be there? So the first thing was to really get people to take that off the table, to take off, I don't deserve to be here. One of my favorite, I don't have to be here, I shouldn't be here stories was from an Israeli who I went to visit, and he was having some problems actually with the white Aryans. He was from Israel. He had never been around this kind of thing. I mean, Israelis deal with hatred, but from people, the Arabs, who are essentially, they're not afraid of them. They're mad. They're sad that the Arabs hate them, but they're not. It's not like Jews and Nazis, right? He didn't know from this, and so he's having problems with the Nazis. And anyways, so he says to me, the Israeli inmate says to me, he says, I'm in prison for it was for marijuana. He says, that's ridiculous. Speaking to me in Hebrew, says, this is ridiculous to be in prison for marijuana. He says, shouldn't be in prison for marijuana. Marijuana, this was, 20 years ago, it wasn't legal yet, but he was like, marijuana, people smoke marijuana all over the place. People smoke it all over the place. The president smokes marijuana, going on and on. So he says, you don't think, should I really be in prison for marijuana? I go, I don't, it's not, don't ask me. He says, but do you think, I said, I don't know. I said, how much marijuana did you have? He said, 26 kilograms. I said, well, wait a second, that's like 60 pounds. So, he's making it sound like he had a joint in the back of his car. Turns out he had a trunk full of 26 kilos. So that was the Israeli way of presenting to me and making me say, yeah, you shouldn't be in prison. So it was a very memorable way of putting me into the spot. And I just said, oh, well, look, you're going to do some time here. So yeah, he that was one of the funniest of I don't belong here. But I did have one, and it was a Passover story. I went to see a guy at prison, and he had he was an older guy. He was in his probably 60s when I saw him, because I remember he was about my dad's age when I went to see him. And he was an Israeli, but had lived in America for a long time. His daughter was a teacher at a day school. He had ups and downs, this guy, and he was an addict. He was a cocaine addict, and I think he was a dealer too, but did a lot of white collar crime, a lot of crimes. All different kinds of stuff. And he said, I was talking to him about being in prison for Pesach, and I had brought him some matzah, and he took it seriously. Sometimes people would ask for matzah, and I, they just want something extra. He actually really wanted the matzah. And I brought him prayer books, and I brought him stuff, and it was meaningful to him. But I said to him, I said, how do you feel about, being in jail for, how do you feel about being in prison for, and he was in a prison that was it was a private prison, privately run prison, but it was a prison up near the other prisons, but it was privately run. So it was a smaller prison, but it was one of these corporate run prisons. And so he said to me, he said, listen, he says, I'm a criminal. I'm always going to be a criminal. He says, that's just who I am. I know that about myself. So I'm going to be in and out of jail my whole life. That's just the way I am. And I said, but you have a daughter and she just had a kid. She wants you to spend time with your grandson. She wants you to have a normal life. He goes, I don't know how to have a normal life. I've always been this way, and I'm honest with myself, and I'm always going to be this way. Yeah.
too. They get used to being in prison.
Well, yeah, and this guy was okay with his life.
Right.
And I looked up what he had done to get himself arrested, and he got caught with drugs, but he got caught because he was driving the wrong way on the Ventura Freeway. He got on an on-ramp, he got on an off-ramp and was driving the wrong way on the freeway. And I thought, I mean, you're laughing. I mean, the reality was it was kind of crazy. I'm reading the file on him and I'm like, look, this guy could have killed people. He didn't kill anyone, didn't hurt anybody. But you know, here's a guy who was so, you know, drugged out that he didn't even know where he was driving. And I mean, I'm on the freeway. I'm on that freeway sometimes. He could have killed me or my wife, my, you know, somebody, you know, whatever. He could have killed anybody. And it was close to home. And I thought to myself, you know, it's so weird that this guy had accepted his fate. He accepted the fact that this was all he could do. And he was a smart guy. I mean, he wasn't a dummy, but he just had this weird attitude. And I thought to myself, it's so sad that, you know, that somehow again, that this had become, he felt that he could never get out of this pattern, and he accepted it.
That was his way of life.
Was such a weird thing. But it was another Passover situation. So yeah, saw a lot of stuff during that time that'll stick with me, and that is I've thought about writing about it before, you know, putting down some of these stories, because they're interesting stories, because they're not just about prison. Obviously, they're about human experience and how the inmates really kind of live life like we do. It's just that they live it under like a pressure cooker, right? You know, it's like all of the emotions, all of the anger, all of the intensity of life, all the ups and downs, they're just pressured into like hot pressure, a hot cook, you know, steam pressure, and then just everything comes out much faster and much harder than it does in life. But it's all the same stuff. It's all the same things. It's just when you see what happens when it's put under pressure and not given a release or time for people to kind of deal with this stuff. So it's just like life, except on a much faster and more pressured level. So those were some interesting Passovers. But again, it helped me learn about Passover and helped me reflect on why Passover is such an important season, and one where we should never take our freedoms for granted. And you know what? It's one of the reasons why when we went through this pandemic, and I thought about, you know, what real prison was like, because people had talked about how they were locked up and how tough it was. I thought to myself, you know, I never spent the night in one of the cells, but I spent enough time in the cells and in that kind of environment to know that spending one night in that kind of place would freak most of us out forever.
There are enough times you know you don't want to be there.
Yeah, I know I don't want to be there. And I know that freedom is a really great thing. And even in that kind of prison, though, you can find a way to actually have freedom. There's things that can't get taken away from you. And even when, you know, your freedoms are restricted, even when we were going through this pandemic, there were things that couldn't be taken away from us. And so we all experienced it a little bit. We all experience what it means to have your freedoms restricted, and how we don't want to go back to that. You know, we don't want to have that happen to us again. So Joseph is in prison. He's in jail for a crime he did not commit. Let's read what happens. And we're going to finish up. We're not going to read this whole chapter today, but we're going to see what happened. Or maybe we'll see. We'll see how far we get into this chapter. Because it says again, same phrase. Vayechi achar hadvarim ha'eleh. Again, same phrase, right? Same phrase that we had here. Right? Same phrase with Potiphar's wife. Vayechi achar hadvarim ha'eleh. Sometime after. How long after? Don't know. But here it's translated as sometime later. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt gave offense to their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two courtiers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the prefect, in the same prison house where Joseph was confined. So most of us know this story a little bit already. The story of the courtiers, the other courtiers. And again, these are courtiers, usually translated as the cupbearer and the baker. What's the King James translation on that? The butler and baker. So the baker part is usually the easy part. The head baker, the head butler. What's important about both of these jobs is that they're in charge of the food and drink preparation. The reason why we usually translate it as cupbearer instead of butler is because the understanding here is that this guy's in charge of the drinks that are brought to Pharaoh, and this is the guy who's in charge of the food that's brought to Pharaoh. Which means that likely, if you're trying to kill the Pharaoh, poison. You either got to get this guy in charge of it, the cupbearer, or the baker. But you can get poison into the Pharaoh if one of these two people works with you on it. These are the guys who are in charge of getting food in front of the Pharaoh.
Yeah, it's like who died that landed these two in jail.
What?
It's like who died that landed these two in jail, you know? What meal did somebody taste, and, you know, both of them are like heading off to the jail.
Yeah. So there's a real question of whether these are people who are also in charge of tasting the food. Were they in charge of tasting the food? And therefore, again, the most likely to, if you have to get poison into the Pharaoh, if either of these two people are working with you, that's the only way to do it. Now, what's interesting about this is that it says that they're in the house of the prefect, in the house of the prison house where Joseph is also. Now, what's interesting about this, which we didn't see before, when we read that he's in the prison house, is that the words that are used here, and this, most of the time people don't point this out, and I want to point it out since we have a little bit more time to look at this. Here it says he's put into the jail, the prison. Here they use the word jail, but it's okay. Chief jailer is the title for this, which is fine. He's in the jail or the prison. Well, here's the weird thing, and this is why I pointed out to you. It says that he's in custody in the house of the prefect. The problem is that we just saw this phrase, the Sar Hatabachim. Remember? This is the guy. This is the name of the position that Potiphar has at the beginning, the prefect. You see that? Sar HaTabachim. So it seems as though the guy who's in charge of the prison system to some extent is Potiphar. So when we talk about why does Potiphar have access to the jail, it seems like it's either on his property or he's in charge of it, like it's his job. It says he's the prefect. He's the Sar HaTabachim. So Joseph is in the prison, or I mean, he's in the place of the prefect, which is where the jail is. So I'm only telling you Potiphar had access to this place because he seems like to have been in charge of the place. That was his responsibility. So whatever Potiphar's role is as a minister, as a courtier, it seems to be this thing. That's why maybe Potiphar could even do it in the first place. So when we talk about like what's really happening in the story, maybe Joseph would have been killed if Potiphar didn't have a place he could have put Joseph. Joseph was lucky to some extent that Potiphar was in charge of this place. How far away was this place from Joseph's house in the first place? Maybe Joseph is literally down the street from his house or on the same property as his house. Potiphar's responsibility.
When I looked up after you said that Potiphar might be a eunuch, I looked up like what reason in Egypt they might have to make somebody a eunuch, and they were saying mostly punishment. So that might connect to him being in charge of a prison, a place of punishment.
It could be.
I don't know. Just thinking about why.
It's a weird thing that he was punished, that he would have been punished to be a eunuch, because he seems to still have a huge role to play in Pharaoh's court. Because it doesn't say he used to be in Pharaoh's court. It says he's in Pharaoh's court. So it's a weird role to play. And again, look, is that our imagination that he was a eunuch? I mean, it could be. I'm only telling you that it's not, it's part of the possibilities of who Potiphar is. But Potiphar is definitely connected to Pharaoh. And it seems as though part of his responsibility is to do exactly what he's doing or where he's got Joseph, which is in the prison, in the royal prison. That's Potiphar's job. It's a weird thing that a lot of people don't catch, which is that Potiphar is maybe even interacting with Joseph where Joseph is. Maybe Potiphar is still hoping that Joseph will be nearby and give him some good luck. Well, he's definitely giving the prison good luck. And here's what it says. The prefect assigned Joseph to them, and he attended them when they had been in custody for some time. It doesn't say the chief jailer did it. And again, I don't want to dwell on it. It's not like, yeah, this is the end of the, like this is the most important thing that you hear. But we normally say, and what people normally say, is that it was the jailer who put Joseph in charge of the guys. But it wasn't. It was Potiphar who did it. It says that. Not the jailer, the prefect. Joseph attended to them. When they had been in custody for some time, both of them, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, dreamed in the same night, each his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. And when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw they were distraught. He asked Pharaoh's courtiers, who were in custody in his master's house. Right there, it tells you in his master's house, which again, most of us assume they were talking about the jailer. Potiphar. Why do you appear downcast today? And they said to him, we had dreams, and there was no one to interpret them. So Joseph said to them, surely God can interpret. Tell me your dreams. So what's interesting about this story that you've, again, maybe heard before, but now you're going to see something in it maybe you didn't see before. They both had a dream at the same night, which is pretty wild and seems to be a miracle. And Joseph seems to tell them right away that they're a miracle, because Joseph says, God can interpret the dreams, but tell them to me. And again, assumedly, tell me, because God will interpret them. I'm not going to interpret them. God will interpret them. What's interesting about this is that the way they tell him, we had these dreams. but there's no one here to interpret them. Which is interesting, not because they had a dream and they want to know the meaning. But I want everyone to catch this. They are in prison, so they don't have anyone who they can tell their dream to, which means that they seem to be saying, they seem to assume that if they were on the outside, they could have told someone their dream and they could have had their dream interpreted. But because they're incarcerated, they can't. Which tells us that, at least in this story, we have to assume this I think we can assume that this isn't the only time that this kind of thing happens, is that the Egyptians, and maybe Israelites too, want to have their dreams interpreted. That they assumed that they could find someone who could interpret their dreams. Now, normally when we read this story, we don't talk about this angle because we talk about it in such a fast way that we just talk about these dreams that they had and Joseph's going to interpret them, and we all know that. But Joseph seems to fit this role of interpreting dreams, which again, they would have had done otherwise. Which seems to imply that they expected to have their dreams interpreted. Which tells us that dream interpretation seems to have been an acceptable or expected even form of understanding who we are. Now, if we said that today, if I told you I had a dream and I can't find anyone to interpret my dream, you'd be like, what are you talking about? What, like, do you normally do that? Do you normally call somebody to interpret your dreams? But what would we say that kind of person would be today? Who would you do that with?
The psychologist
Correct. The
Therapist.
or a friend. I mean,
correct. So unless we're talking to a friend, to a confidant, to a partner, a spouse, somebody that we would share our dreams with, very rarely would you go up to a stranger or even a casual acquaintance and say, I had a dream. I'd like you to tell me about, what do you think my dream means? Because most of the time, if somebody said that to you, you'd think they were crazy. Because sharing a dream, we would normally say, that's it's an intimate thing. That's something that you would do with somebody you trust really well, but not a normal, ordinary person. But I think it's interesting that we would, in your first response to Sarah's comment, and I think most of us would agree, is that the only professional we would hire or engage with, I wouldn't say hire, but go to someone to do this with, would be a psychologist.
And I am consulted about dreams from time to time.
And so I was waiting for you, Joyce. So Joyce,
Yes.
so what it tells us is that over 3,000 years ago, people, at least from the standpoint of dream, believed that there was an importance
Yes.
in interpreting the dream, that people wanted to find meaning in their dreams. These guys, and we assume by the way they say it, that this is fairly matter-of-factly and seems to be fairly casually that they say this, they want their dream interpreted. And because that's what they normally would do, they want to find someone who can do it. And they just so happen to have found a guy who can do it in the most unlikely of places.
or maybe it is strange that we don't put enough weight into dreams today. I mean, it is
Some
our,
people still do.
yeah, I mean, I do.
Yeah.
I look at it and I think I take them very seriously, and I think I always have, but it says a lot about your internal workings, and
Yes.
we spend half our life asleep, if not more.
Wait, did you say half your life asleep?
No.
How much are you?
Well, think about babies. Well, first of all, there's 24 hours in a day. You're asleep like 8 hours.
That's about
Babies,
That's a third.
a third of our lives, but
and added to it all of the time you sleep when you're much older and when you're first born.
Okay, I mean, listen, let's agree.
Maybe, maybe 1/3. Okay, I'll give you 1/3.
It's a good chunk.
Good.
a good chunk
I'll
of-
take a third.
Yeah,
Now, we will tell you, for those who've studied dreams before, they'll tell you that actually most of our sleep is not in dreams.
Right.
So it would be great if it was, or at least for some of us, some of our dreams are the kind of dreams we'd like to keep going. But actually only a fraction of our sleep is in a dream state.
Mhm.
But that being said, it would be good if we had people that we could talk to about our dreams. By the way, it also implies that people can remember their dreams. I mean, obviously these guys remembered their dreams, but it also is an interesting idea that people maybe trained themselves and did things consciously to be able to access their dreams.
well, I have a friend who was telling me all about dream yoga. Dream yoga is like it's a practice of like writing down your dreams, but also like
Mhm.
learning how to change your dreams while you're in your dreams. And there is something to it.
Yeah, I think because in our society and the way that we approach our lives today, we don't put a lot of value into our dreams. We kind of dismiss it, and we don't really deal with that in a serious way, in a scientific way. We're probably missing a huge we're missing an ability to access part of our brains that we're
Mhm.
otherwise access. So we definitely should be more receptive to dreams and to dream interpretation, and being serious about the ability to use that time of our lives, which again, whether it's a third or however much it is, that time is spent with the ability to do that. And we're learning more and more about it, but we're not nearly as serious about it. We don't spend nearly enough effort and money on understanding this. We've definitely not prioritized our understanding of sleep and dreams enough. It's really not something that we put a lot of importance on in our society. And I think eventually we will. I mean, I do think that we're understanding more about it, and we'll get to some breakthroughs where we will understand how important it is for us to take this seriously and to help us both in our conscious and unconscious states to understand that there's things that we could do better and have better and healthier lives if we were able to use our dreams effectively during our waking hours. So what's interesting about this is that they just gave away a little secret here, which is that they took it seriously. There's no other explanation for what they said other than dream interpretation was part of their way of life. Now,
Well, yeah.
was it the same way in the land of Israel at this time? Did Joseph have that same, did Joseph and his family have the same importance to it? Well, we heard about Joseph's dreams. When he tells his family, he seems to have interpreted his own dreams, which maybe is not something you're supposed to do, or definitely don't share your interpretations of your own dreams, which he came across very, very poorly. His brother's telling him that.
I mean, he described his dreams, but didn't his dad kind of interpret it for him by saying, "Are you saying that we're going to be bowing to you?"
Well, the way that he shares his dreams, right, it seems to imply that he is telling his family what his dream is. So there seems to be this understanding that maybe if we engage in a kind of situation where we want to share our dreams rather than and kind of ask for and rather than tell people our dreams, that we're actually putting ourselves in a position where we're kind of telling people what we think the dream means. And there's this understanding that maybe Joseph should have kept his dream to himself when his dreams to himself when he talks to his family initially. And so that he got himself into trouble because of that, right? He got himself in trouble because of his bragging, if you will, about his dream. And that if he understood what his dreams were, which he seems to understand his dreams, he knew what he was saying. And so there is that understanding that Joseph, to some extent, asked for that or boasted about it and did it in such a way that was harmful to him, but he created that situation. So yes, he didn't tell them, hey, I'm going to lord over you, but the way he presented the dreams to them, he thought enough about it, is the implication that when he shared it with them, his father, remember, also is not happy with his dreams. So he does get himself into trouble with his dream. Now, of course, in this case, interpreting other people's dreams, he ends up unlocking his final success by interpreting other dreams. We'll get to that next week. But
So did was Potiphar's wife ever mentioned again after it says that Potiphar was angry? I'm just wondering if she survived that.
does he say anything more? Well, as I told you, he's been behind the scenes controlling.
No, but does she appear at all? Because it's like that's the end of her.
We're not sure. I will tell you, we'll discuss it when we get to the one place where he is mentioned coming up. And we're not sure whether it's him or somebody else. And I will tell you, it is not clear whether it's not clear. And that's a weird thing for me to say, but there are differences of opinion whether he makes another appearance in this story.
Well, I meant like, does his wife, or was his wife?
His wife doesn't make another appearance, and we're not sure he does, where he does anything, but maybe he does. That's all I'm going to tell you. I'm not being evasive about it, but it's part of Joseph's story when he comes out. So we're not there yet. We will be there next week, I promise. But with Joseph's situation here, with the dream interpretation, he is going to interpret someone else's dreams. Whether this was an Israelite practice as well, a Hebrew practice, again, it's a family, but was it already part of what Abraham and his family did, or was it something that the Canaanites did in their land, which was what they were living? So maybe they understood that from a cultural atmosphere too. We don't know. We don't know whether dream interpretation was something that was foreign to Joseph. It doesn't seem like it's foreign to him based on his dreams, but the Egyptians seem to take it for granted that they're going to get that in a normal situation, someone could share this dream with them. And there is an important Jewish tradition that says, in our tradition, that a dream unexplained is like a letter unopened.
Oh, nice.
Letter unopened. So you're supposed to share your dreams. You're supposed to find, hopefully, somebody who can interpret dreams and help you understand the dreams. But it really does kind of, I always ask my kids when they wake up what they dreamt about. I always like to make them kind of think about their dreams. And usually, we only remember the last dream of the day, right at the night, right before we wake up. Last dream, that's usually the one we remember. But sometimes you'll have a dream and just keep going back. You wake up and go back into the dream, and it seems to be it's a multi-episode dream.
Yeah.
But this is a very important part of our lives. So again, in all seriousness, it was funny when Sarah said we spend half of our lives dreaming, but I will say we spend
a lot of time with cats.
well, all I'm saying is that Sarah's sleeping way too much. But I will say this: no, it'd be great. I would listen. I wouldn't mind sleeping half the time, but I will tell you this: that it is a very important part of our lives. The time that we spend in dream state is very important. I mean, as I said, we're going to learn more and more about it as we progress, hopefully, and learn more about the way our minds work. But it must be important because, again, there is so much of our lives where we're engaged and we're spending it in a dream state that to not understand that, even if it's only 15% of our life or 10% of our life, to leave 10% of our lives unknown and unexperienced, unexamined is such a waste. It's such a tremendous waste of our lives. So
What's interesting too is
to journal. What?
Sometimes you remember dreams you had when you were very young that stay with you your whole life. And And that's pretty powerful to think about. Like you have a dream that you remember from from dreaming when you're a child.
Correct. Correct. Which means that there are dreams that to some extent, based on what you just said, we have dreams that are so important that they essentially function as memory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's definitely a huge crossover between dreams and memory. Just even the way that memory changes over time.
Yep. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph. He said to him, "In my dream, there was a vine in front of me. On the vine were 3 branches. It had barely budded when out came its blossoms, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." So it seems very clear that his role as butler, I mean, I have no issue with the word butler if the important part of what a butler does is place a drink in the Pharaoh's hand. So he is the chief cupbearer, he's the chief drink taster, if you will. And his job is to give a cup to Pharaoh, which is what he does in his dream. He presses the grapes and he makes the wine or juice and he gives it to Pharaoh. And Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will pardon you and restore you to your post." Lift up your head is the words that are literally used. Lift up your head and restore you to your post. You will place the Pharaoh's cup in his hand, as was your custom formerly when you were his cupbearer. Well, it seems pretty clear. What is the translation that they use there? Mary? His cupbearer. So I don't know why this word would be charged with butler, because normally when we use the word butler, we assume that there's some guy named Jeeves who comes up to you and does other things besides just give you a cup. Because it seems like that's what his job is. He might have buttled other times. He buttled for him in other ways, but his most important stuff is giving. I mean, that's all it says he does, is he gives the Pharaoh's cupbearer. So that's the important thing. He gives his Pharaoh his cup and he's going to go back to the job that he had before, which was bringing him the cup. Wow, what a wonderful dream. Things are going to get good for you. And what does Joseph say? "But think of me when all is well with you again, and do me the kindness of mentioning me to Pharaoh so as to free me from this place." So he says to him, "Say some words to Pharaoh to get me out." Which begs the question. I want to put this in your mind. You may never have thought about this before. If Potiphar put him in direct connection with the butler, and he just did a solid, he just helped the guy out in prison who can help him when he's on the outside. Did Potiphar set this up in the first place? Which is the only way for him to get free is for him to come in contact with somebody who can free him. So Potiphar knows he can't free him, but maybe Pharaoh can free him. So did Potiphar set this up in the first place? Did Potiphar put him in contact with the butler, the cupbearer in the first place? Somebody who can get Joseph out. Because even though he put him in there, he can't get him out. So that might have been Potiphar's plan all along. Just to get his righteous slave out. All right. Everything sounds good along that line. But wait, there's more. Oh, here he tells him. "For in truth, I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, nor have I done anything here that they should put me in this dungeon." So tells him what happened. "I'm not here for any good reason." When the chief baker saw how favorably he had interpreted, he said to Joseph, in my dream, there were similarly, right? Also, he says similarly, there were 3 open work baskets. The translation there are baskets with white bread or white baskets. And again, we're not really sure. The baskets were on his head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of food for Pharaoh that a baker prepares. And the birds were eating it out of the basket above my head. Joseph answered, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. And in 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale you upon a pole. And the birds will pick off your flesh. Well, what's so wonderful about this phrase is that now lifting up your head means something totally different here, which is not just that you're going to have your head lifted up, but maybe your head will be lifted up off your body. Whoa. Because not only is he going to get killed, he's going to be put on a pole. And not only is he going to be put on a pole, but the birds are going to eat his flesh. It's not a good way for him to end up. Holy moly, what happened? On the 3rd day, his birthday, Pharaoh made a banquet for all his officials, and he singled out his chief cupbearer and his chief baker among his officials. And he restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he placed the cup in the Pharaoh's hand. But the chief baker he impaled, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. So what happens is exactly what Joseph said was going to happen. Now, the baker probably, again, in that moment where he's told, your dream doesn't end, your future is not as good. Your future is not a good one. Well, what had happened? You know, look, the biblical interpretation is that there was this plot to kill the Pharaoh. They both were implicated in the plot. Pharaoh found out who was responsible. It was the baker, and the baker gets killed. So Joseph knows because God told him what was going to happen, and the dream seemed the same. And so because Joseph knows who's the guilty party, or God's told him, right, who the guilty party is, he's able to now show that he has got the gift. He's now interpreted the dream correctly, and everybody knows it, or at least they know it. The people who need to know it know it. And the last line of the chapter, the chief cupbearer did not think of Joseph, he forgot him. What's interesting about that phrase is that not only did he not think of Joseph, he forgot him. Now, that seems a little excessive. Could be that he just didn't think about him, but he forgot him. And so the rabbis like to say, that's not normal. That's not a normal thing. It's one thing if he didn't think about him, but that he forgot him, that's a miracle. And so they actually say that God did indeed kind of wipe his memory. He didn't remember Joseph. Because normally, like something crazy like that happens, you're never going to forget it. So it's not just, oh, I totally forgot what happened in prison. You know, I just wiped that off of my mind, right? I don't want to think about prison anymore. But come on, it's how he got out of prison. He's never going to forget that story. That's not normal. And so the rabbis, the interpretation is 100% God made him forget. Why? Because it's not time for Joseph to get out of prison yet. The time isn't right. And so there seems to be an understanding here that Joseph has to stay in prison a little longer, which doesn't seem to be fair. Because, my friends, the next Torah portion, Miketz, tells us that 2 more years pass before this guy gets out of jail. He's got 2 more years to stay in prison. This is not a month or 2. It's not a week. It's 2 years. It's 2 years of a young man's life. Joseph went into this descent into hell, if you will, when he was 17 years old, is when he got thrown into the pit. He was 17. He spends the next 13 years of his life as a slave and in prison. His entire years of his 20s, over a decade, is gone. By the time he comes out of prison, he's a man who should have had a life of getting married, having kids. He's lost a decade of his life, and not just any decade. I don't know, but a lot of people, I wouldn't say that's necessarily the best time of their lives, but it's oftentimes one of the best times of their lives. It usually is. We've created a system, at least in our country, in our society, where people go off to college and go to graduate school. And if you ask most people who've lived in America for the last 70, 80 years, 90 years, they'll tell you that the highlight of their life was this time. The exception might be people who served in war during their 18s and 20s. It might not have been the best time of their life. But for a lot of people, they had a good life. One of the greatest successes of our modern world, of our post-war situation, has been the last 60, 70 years of kids, a lot of American kids, a lot of Jewish kids going off to college when they're 17, 18 years old and having a great time. And parents encourage it. We pay for it. We expect it. We want our kids to have a great time in their college years. We want them to have experiences, to grow, to travel, to go to Europe. And this guy lost all of that. So when I imagine Joseph, when I think about Joseph, and I think about what it would have been like to be in prison, to be a slave from the time I was 17 till the time I was 30, that's a crushing feeling. That's a horrible thing for me to imagine, to have that time of my life stolen from me. It's terrible. So Joseph is languishing in prison as we're here. And it seems as though, at least for the next couple of years, it's part of something out of his control, part of God's plan. Because the time's not right. Pharaoh has to have his dreams. The famine and the setup for the world-changing event hasn't happened yet. It's not time for Joseph to come out yet. Most of us would have a hard time imagining that we're part of a bigger plan and that our role to play, we're willing to put our lives on hold or to sit in prison for a couple of years while things are at play. Joseph doesn't know it, but something's going on that's much bigger than him. And yet we're left with this reality that he loses these years of his life. So let's keep that in mind as we read the Joseph story over the next several weeks, what it was like, what he had to live through. We read it in a day, we read it in a night, but he lived it over 13 years. A guy who went from being a teenager to now being a guy when this is happening is roughly 27, 28 years old when the cupbearer and the baker come to talk to him. He spent 10 years of his life without freedom and without the ability to control his own destiny. And what his life would have been like if he had lived back in Canaan with his brothers, with his father. So this good-looking guy has just spent some of the best years of his life looking good. Don't matter so much when you're in prison, where at least depends on what kind of prison situation you're in, but it's not necessarily a good thing to be an effeminate looking guy being locked up in prison for the last 10 years.
Did he need those years in prison in order to come to the maturity to do better later? I think so.
Look, the rabbis definitely are going to leave us with that impression that Joseph needed to that Joseph needed to grow up and that Joseph needed to become a man. But I will tell you one thing, all of these things were at play, and don't think that that wasn't something that they were thinking about. Because while, again, the prison situation is one that we think about because we've seen all the television shows, we've seen Oz, we've seen Orange is the New Black, we've seen all the shows where every show where a cop goes into prison to interview an inmate, all those kind of things, all the documentaries we've seen about prison. The reality is that that's not what he's living with.
Mhm.
The rabbis knew what it was like to be a slave. And we're supposed to be thinking about that at Passover, 2 nights, when we think about what it was like to be a slave in Egypt. And the fact that it wasn't for Joseph and it wasn't for this story to play out, as it was, none of us would have been slaves. So when we think about why we were slaves, how we wound up being slaves, think about the irony in the Bible. It's there for you, folks. Joseph was the first to go. He was the first to wind up in Egypt as a slave, but we all wound up being slaves. We all wound up having our freedoms taken away in Egypt. So think about that when we're thinking about Passover and how we wound up as slaves in Egypt for generations. All because, again, as according to the rabbis in the Midrash, his brothers had jealousy over a coat. Now, I'm just telling you, that's one of the interpretations, how family dysfunction caused generations and millions of Jews to wind up being slaves. I'm only telling you, it's one of those interpretations. So everybody, we wish you a Chag Sameach as we think about liberation, as we think about freedom, as we think about escaping our own bondage, our own personal circumstances of not being the kind of people that we need to be. Keeping all this in mind, we wish you a Chag Sameach, a wonderful season of freedom. And we'll see you next week. We'll see you hopefully in a more free and just world. We pray that maybe Elijah will visit our homes and announce the redeeming and the kind of the healing of the world, the time when everything will be brought back and made whole. So we wish you again a Chag Sameach, and we're praying for more peace in the world and freedom, especially for those people that are suffering right now in Ukraine too. So take care, everybody. Thank you for being with us, and stay healthy.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Rabbi.
See you all. Take care. It's good seeing you.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Night, Joyce.
Good night, David, Cheryl,
Good
John,
night.
Mike, everyone. Good night.
Good night.